All right, everybody. Dr. Andy Woods here. This is Pastor's Point of View number 231. I'm here with a very special friend and guest, the Honorable Rick Miller. And this particular video is going to be released on the eve of a very important midterm election that's right around the corner. One of the things that a mutual passion we share is why God's people, are not more involved in the political process, because a lot of the insanity that we see happening in our culture, we think we can actually put the brakes on some of it if we go out and vote intelligently and biblically on November the 8th. Early voting in Texas, do you have the dates on those?
Early voting starts Monday, this coming Monday.
Okay, that would be the 24th?
Yes.
And it goes through the 4th?
Yes.
And then the election is November 8th.
Correct, Tuesday the 8th.
So let me, this is a man next to me that has a tremendous background and resume, and this is why we wanted to use him as a reservoir to draw from, during this critical time in our nation's history. So let me just read his bio real quick. Rick Miller attended the United States Naval Academy. I don't know if you know this, but my grandfather went there. There's actually, on the rowing team, on one of the boats there is named after him at the
Is that right?
Naval Academy.
I did not know
And
that.
then I had an uncle that went there as well.
Oh my gosh.
And the other
What a
uncle
connection.
went to the Air Force Academy. So we have a lot in common here. He also attended the Dwight D. Eisenhower School for National Security and Resource Strategy, where he earned his Bachelor of Science degree. Rick Miller was a member of a baseball team in Mexico. Wow.
Was.
For which he later worked as a United States naval aviator, in which Miller served in top arrangements. He served as a fellow for the Strategic Studies Group, the chief of naval operations, if I have that right.
That's right.
Rick Miller had earned medals such as the Meritorious Service Medal, Legion of Merit, and Defense Superior Service Medal. Mm-hmm. He also earned the Naval Commendation Medal. After being discharged, Miller had established, and you're going to have to help me with this corporation, the
Trevanian Group.
How do you say that?
Trevanian
Group business, for which he was the chairperson of the TEC International and was a member of the chairperson of other establishments. In 2013, Miller won election for the 26th District of the Texas House of Representatives. He succeeded politician Charles Howard. Miller and his wife live in Sugar Land. He currently is involved in 3 not-for-profits supporting foster children, veterans, and then the preservation of historic sites.
Yes.
So you always have been and continue to be a pretty busy guy.
Yes, I think I should be busy. The older I get, the busier I want to be. So.
Well, it's interesting because in an email, which kind of led to this program, you were talking about, just to me privately, about the upcoming election and how we need to get Christians engaged. And you were talking about how you, when you were in the Texas House, saw that as sort of a divine calling, and you tried to reflect Christian values when you were in that role. So am I representing that right? And how did you come to that way of thinking?
Well, you're absolutely right. And I have to go back and give credit to my first wife, Babs. She and I, when we moved to Texas at around 2000, we started to get settled in, and then we met the right people who were encouraging us to get involved in the political scene here in Fort Bend County. And so after that, I went to an evening with a pastor, Rick Scarborough. I don't know whether you've heard of him.
I do know him, yeah, or know of him.
Know of him. And so I'm sitting, listening to him talk about why he was doing what he was doing, especially in the education of our children. because he stepped out of his pastorship to take on this mission of educating people about what's happening in our school systems. And so I'm sitting there listening and talking, and I said, you know what? Babs, he's talking directly to me, that I need to step up and I need to get involved. And so I did, and ran for my first political office of a precinct chair, which is the basement of all offices. And then shortly thereafter became the chairman of the party here in Fort Bend County and then the State House. So that's what happened to me.
Yeah, so it's just one baby step after
One
another.
baby step
The
and
Lord opening different venues.
Right.
Now, we were talking a little bit off air how one of your mentors is a gentleman by the name of Norm Mason, and you have gave me this book a few years ago.
I did.
But this is a critical book to your understanding. The title of it is The Political Imperative, The Assignment from God, The Biblical Role of Christians in Public Policy, Civil Government, and the Political Process. Tell me about Norm Mason and the contents of this book.
Well, Norm is a fantastic individual, strong Christian man, always has been, and he and his wife were really involved in all of the political activities at the time, the right political activities from a Christian perspective. And so Norm wrote this book, I believe, in 2011, right when I was standing up to run a campaign for the Texas House. And so Norm was a mentor. And then if you read this book, it's a short little book, but it tells us the imperative is for us as Christians to get involved in the political process in one way or another, either as participating in the process or encouraging others to do that. And so it's a short read, but it's all biblically based. And God created these three entities: the government, the family, and the church. And so it meant a lot to me at the time. It encouraged me to stick with it and to work hard. And I just put my faith in the Lord. I said, Lord, if you want me to do this, then I will get elected. And I got elected. So.
And people can get this, I would assume, wherever books are sold, internet.
They might be able to. Again, it goes back, it's over 10 years old, 11 years old. So I'm hoping that it's still available to get. And I can talk to Norm and see if he still has these books, but he gave me a bunch of them.
Okay. So if you need a copy, you can contact us even here at
Right,
Sugarland Bible
right.
Church.
We'll try to, yeah,
we can
get that.
Connect it and get this
But
done.
I would strongly encourage people,
Yeah.
Christians, to read this.
Because the contents of this book really represent what we want to talk about here. We're on the eve of a pivotal midterm election. Most Christians are sort of, we'll talk about this as we progress, they have a tendency to look at politics as the secular world, and let's just focus on the gospel, the church, evangelism, all important subjects.
Right.
But people have a tendency to bifurcate these in their minds spiritually, and this is the type of thing that this book critiques, right?
It does.
Okay.
It absolutely does.
So we're going to get into that. So, what I have, just for purposes of easy memorization, are 4 S's. As we, talk about the Christian involvement in public policy. Okay. So let's start with stewardship. Here's our list of 4. But we have the concept of stewardship in the Bible. I'm thinking of 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 2, where Paul the Apostle says, "In the case, moreover, it is required of stewards that one be found trustworthy." I'm also thinking of Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30, which is really the parable of the various stewards. And you know that parable well. I'll just read the opening line here. It says, "For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted them with various possessions. To one he gave 5 talents, which is a numerical denomination at the time this was written. to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability, and he went on a long journey. And so the point of it is the Lord returns after a season, and he wants to know, what did you do with what I gave you?
That's right.
And so we have in the Bible a concept of stewardship. A steward is not an owner, but a manager.
That's right.
And we manage things for God, and the day in history will come where he's going to say, hey, what did you do with what I entrusted to you? And I think the 3 things that we're given to be stewards of are A, our time, B, our talent or our abilities,
Right.
and C, our treasure. The 3 T's, as I call them. But here's an element of stewardship I never hear spoken of in Christianity. How about your own government?
That's true. Absolutely right. And of course, we're not necessarily seeing that stewardship today in our government. I go back to my initial involvement in the Texas House. And one of the things we talked about earlier was the Texas legislature was set up with a House and a Senate mirroring what was going on in Washington. Now, I haven't researched this, but for information, there are 150 members in the Texas House, and there are also 150 Psalms.
In the book of Psalms.
In the book of Psalms. And there are 31 members in the Texas Senate. Well, guess how many Proverbs there are?
31 Proverbs.
31. So when I was going out, and I spent a lot of time out in the public talking about that, I would always bring up to you, hey, do you know what the number 150 means? And I would always relate that to, well, oh, by the way, this is the way the legislature was set up. 150 members after the Psalms, and then 31 after the Senate. So, but you're right about the stewardship, and God has given us so much in this country that we need to be taken care of. It's our responsibility to do that. And so I looked at that from my role in the legislature. Matter of fact, I set up a little matrix of decision making whenever I would consider a bill. And one of the items on there, if not the first one, was, is this a biblical worldview thing, bill that I can vote for? And then there were other things about, anyway, that it meet my other criteria. And so I think it's so important for us to be good stewards of what God has given us, and He expects us to do that. I think. Would you agree?
Well, the thing is, we have a privilege that most people in human history could only dream of, where we have the ability as Christians. I mean, they don't have this in Saudi Arabia, I guarantee you. The ability to influence the direction of our government through voting, through going deeper than that, as you've done with your career, becoming involved in the public policy process. And of the T's, time, talent, and treasure, I have to add stewardship over the American government onto that list. And it's a tremendous entrustment God has given us. Now, you represented District 26. Do you have a biblical, I remember you gave a biblical number for that. Maybe I'm misquoting you. You had the legislature divided, as you just said, and then you had something special for District 26. Maybe it was Psalm 26.
It was Psalm 26.
And why did you? What's
well,
significant?
because it gives guidance for me to who I should be associating with and relying on and working with in the legislature to be selective in who I'm working with. And so, I mean, that was clear guidance to me. And so it's interesting. And every desk on the House floor, there's a Bible. Okay, and every session, the member who sits in that desk, of course, I sat in the same desk for 6 years, but you write a scripture that means something to you. And I always wrote Psalm 26.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's just like because most people, when you talk about the intricacies of government, their eyes kind of glaze over. But that's just a neat little nomenclature that you developed concerning how to, as J. Vernon McGee used to say, put the cookies on the bottom shelf.
That's right.
Because you can't influence something you don't understand.
That's right.
And I remember when you asked me to come and pray in Austin
Yes.
before the beginning of the session.
Yes.
You recall that, and
Yes.
he said something very interesting to me. You said, you can turn this prayer into a sermon if you want to, because they're all going to be quiet and listening to you. So I prayed for 3 minutes, and I honestly was authentically praying, but I worked into it some Benjamin Franklin quotes and
Yes.
some things that we would want emphasized as Christians. So, you remind me of, Jesus says, what does he say? Be as wise as gentle as sheep, but be as wise as wolves. Something to that effect.
Right.
And
Well, that was very important that you did that, because that in the Texas House, that's the only time there's no noise. That's the only time no one's talking,
yeah,
except for the pastor giving the opening prayer. And
yeah,
so that was a great opportunity, and I'm glad you seized it.
yeah.
So,
Now, the first opportunity you gave me is you said, "Look, we are in the middle now of a special session.
mhm.
We have a chance to pass some regulations on abortion
Right.
clinics that we've never had before. Can you come down and testify before the committee?" They give you 3 minutes to speak. We waited in your office probably till after midnight,
Yes, you did.
and I finally had a chance to speak. Of course, the left was there screaming and yelling the whole time.
That's right.
I had a chance to speak from my worldview. Would you say pastors becoming involved in something that simple makes a difference?
Makes a real difference, and I'm glad you took that opportunity, and because I asked you to do that. That was in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
That was a session that went, which is normally about 140 days, went 3 extra overtime sessions. It was like a deployment in the Navy, right, to Austin, which none of us want to do. But that was the initial, one of the biggest bills at the time regarding abortion, in the 20-week fetal pain bill, and it took us 2 overtime sessions to get that passed. And I really appreciate you being there to do that. And at the time, that was such a huge issue going on in the state, and yet there are pastors of churches around here who had no idea that that
Right.
was even happening.
Right.
And so, and what a crucial time it was. And so I'm glad you did that. Now, with the decision of the Supreme Court,
Yeah, Dobbs overruling Roe. Mm-hmm.
that's right. Now there are no abortions, legal abortions that can be had in the state of Texas.
That's amazing.
It's fantastic.
And so Texas became one of those, what do they call them, trigger laws,
Right.
where right when Roe versus overturned, boom,
Right.
Abortion became illegal in Texas.
Right.
So, folks, if you don't think politics matters, think how many
Well,
unborn children have been saved.
oh my gosh, yes, and the abortion clinics being put out of business. That started in 2013, because that was part of it, and so from 2013 to 22, it's now we finally arrived.
Wow.
And I remember talking with the Texas Right to Life people. I said, well, look, isn't it time to do a heartbeat bill? A heartbeat, because the heartbeat is detectable about, I don't know how many days, 18 days or whatever. And they said, well, we don't have the research to support that yet, but some states have passed that.
Mm-hmm.
And now with the Supreme Court decision in Texas, there's no abortion. So
Yeah.
fantastic.
So this is all under the category of biblical stewardship. Let me put up this quote here from Ben Franklin. It says, at the close of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, when queried as he left Independence Hall on the final day of deliberation, in the notes of Dr. James McHenry, one of Maryland's delegates to the Constitutional Convention, a lady asked Benjamin Franklin, well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy? And here's Franklin's response, a republic if you can keep it, close quote. In other words, we've given you a miracle.
That's right.
Another book you gave me talks about the Constitution as a, what is it, 5,000
Or the 5,000-year leap.
5,000-year leap, something in human history that has never happened.
Right.
It's yours. It's in your lap. I love what Benjamin Franklin said. Now, whether it gets preserved for the next generation is your responsibility.
It's up to us. It's up to us, and if we care about this and we identify with the issues that are going on in the public square or from Washington or wherever, even here in Texas, we have some issues in the legislature that are very tough sometimes, and it's taking that stand. I remember when I was the party chairman here, one of the little slogans I put in place was "Show up, stand up, and speak up." And it was on everything we put out, and that was taking residence across the county with our people in our party system. I don't know whether I can mention that or not.
No, you can mention
Republican Party, and so, but at that time, Fort Bend County was different demographically than it is today.
Yeah.
We didn't have to worry about losing elections. Now we have to worry about, because we haven't won elections in the last 2 cycles.
Yeah.
So, but showing up, standing up, and speaking up is what we're talking about today for all Christians.
Yeah.
To do that.
And, as a nonprofit, we don't endorse, and that's not what we're doing here. We're giving you a chance. You're not even running for anything. So
I may run again.
You might run again in the future. But we're giving you a chance to come in from your own life experience and talk about the importance of Christians' involvement, in the public square.
If I can just add,
Please.
I think a big factor in this, Andy, is the church. And I remember I sent you a text a couple of weeks ago about I heard Dr. Young
Yes.
at Second Baptist talk about this wokeness going on, but I said, man, that just really resonated with me. If pastors like you are willing to speak and say how important this is and how important it is for Christians to get involved, then that's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
It's going to make a huge difference.
Now, how important is it? Let's put up this quote by Charles Finney, who basically led the Second Great Awakening in the United States of America. And he, in his lectures on revival, lecture number 15, this is what he says. And I'm not endorsing every single theological thing of these people I'm quoting. I'm just saying this quote is right on. He says, "The church must take right ground to politics. The time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics. Christians have," this is what you're talking about. Right. Is this guy related to you?
Yeah,
Christians have been exceedingly guilty in this matter, but the time has come when they must act differently. God cannot sustain this free and blessed country which we love and pray for unless the church will take right ground. It seems sometimes as if the foundations of the nation are becoming rotten. He said that in his day.
Right.
That's how we feel in our day.
Yes.
And Christians seem to act as if they think God does not see what they do in politics. But I tell you, he does see it, and he will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics.
Amen. Holy cow. Let me tell you a little story about this.
Let's do it.
Okay. When I first got involved in running my first time, I was a member of another church, and I had asked, can I get in and talk to the deacons of the church, right? Well, the answer was no. I said, what do you mean no? Right? I'm a member of this church. I've been very active and doing. How come I can't? Well, because we have people from both political. We'll invite my opponent in to talk as well. And so I was not allowed to do that. And so that really sent me a message about that particular church. But that's okay. So anyway, it was an interesting time, and but that didn't bother me, other than for that church to do that.
Yeah, it kind of opens your eyes to the wokeness, as
Yes.
Dr. Ed Young is critiquing in a sermon series going on in most churches, where people are not starting from the Bible and thinking public policy. Something's going on in the evangelical mind. Let's switch topics to our second S here, and that has to do with salt and light.
Oh, yes.
In fact, we have an organization locally that you're involved in sometimes called Salt and Light, trying to get Christians involved in politics. I'm not sure if that organization still exists, but I've heard that organization's name around.
I'm not
Okay.
sure what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think the title of it was
Salt and Light?
Salt and Light, and I love the title, but it comes out of Matthew 5,
Sure.
13 through 16, where Jesus says, "You are the light of the world," speaking to us, his people. "A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Let your light shine." Now, how do you do that when you shrink your influence to the four walls of the church? "Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Salt is a preservative in society. How can the salt function when it stays in the salt shaker? Where would we be without light if we were just sort of groping around in darkness?
Right.
Jesus says we're the light. How do you be the light unless you're willing to let your light shine in the midst of darkness,
Right.
like Austin, for example?
Well, that's right, and you can't be afraid to let your light shine and to let people know what you stand for, what you believe in. Even today when I teach leadership and personal development to veterans primarily, but I'm working with one company to do that. But the Christian perspective comes out in that process because the real leadership manual is the Bible, right? And I always carry a couple of Bibles that focus on the leadership aspects of the Bible when I do that class. So God expects us to be that light and to be that salt, to make it taste better or to make it come across better, right? Or make it important. And so that's what I took on. I had, when I just had that support from a lot of people in my initial campaigning because they believed like I did. Strong Christian people. Hey, let's help this guy get elected. And so I'll never forget that.
Well, this salt and light, there's a guy named John Winthrop who is really pivotal in the foundation of the United States. He's one of our early Puritan leaders, and he took this verse and stuck it right into the realm of government, and that's why we have America. He said in his model for Christian charity, and people will notice that these quotes I'm giving are not manufactured. You can find these online at the Winthrop Papers. He said, quote, "For we must consider that we shall be, future America, a city set upon a hill." That's exactly what Jesus said. "The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be a byword throughout the world." And then he said something else. This is absolutely fascinating. He said, quote, "It will be a service to the church of great consequence to carry the gospel into those parts," that's the new land, "to help on the coming of the fullness of the Gentiles, and to raise a bulwark against the kingdom of the Antichrist, which in his day the Jesuits labor to rear up in these parts," close quote. When I first read that quotation, I finally understood why God allowed this miracle called America to come into existence. It's designed by the Holy Spirit to be a bulwark or a defense against the one world system of the Antichrist. And the globalists, whether it's Klaus Schwab or whoever, as they're plotting world government, their number one concern is, what are we going to do about America? How can we subjugate America? And this quote from Winthrop explains that. And this was given back in the 1500s.
It absolutely does. And if you go back to our founders and what was important to them, I think I saw a slide here that said, 34% of what our founding fathers put together absolutely came from the Bible. So that's where our country started, and it'd be nice to go back to that time.
Well, we're talking about, should Christians be involved in public policy? If Christians at the foundation of America weren't involved in public policy, we wouldn't have the United States. Let's put up that slide he was just talking about, the founders' sources. This comes from the work of Charles Heinemann and Don Lutz, who at the time were professors at the University of Houston, professors of political science, and all they were doing was, they really did everything to prove, as far as I know. They were just honest scholars, and they were basically going through everything that our founding fathers referenced. So they looked at monographs, speeches, and they discovered that 34% of their citations came from the Bible, 4 times more than the other sources. The next source was Montesquieu, where we get separation of powers, 8% of the time. The source after that was Blackstone, where we get the whole idea of unalienable rights, and 3% of the time was John Locke, where we get the idea of limited government. And if I had time, I would show you that Montesquieu was steeped in the Bible.
Sure.
As was Blackstone. In fact, Finney, who we quoted from earlier, received his calling into the ministry from the Holy Spirit by studying Blackstone's commentaries on the law. Think about that. A guy studying to be a lawyer saw so much scripture that he got saved and went into the ministry. And then after that is Locke. He was steeped in the Bible. So I was here with Johnny Teague just the other day, and he says, our founding documents really are not Montesquieu, Blackstone, and Locke. It's the Bible. That's right. Because our founders were quoting the Bible, and when they weren't quoting the Bible, they were quoting men who were influenced by the Bible.
Well, it's absolutely true. And if you just look at one of them, George Washington, and and read his writings, read what he had to say. The Bible influenced him tremendously, and we thank God that it did, because that's why we have what we have today, the miracle of America. And so the issue is, can we keep it, as we read about, from Franklin, and it's up to us to do that. I think it's up to us Christians to stand up and take and do what we can.
Now, you were talking about your experience with other churches and things. We want to stay neutral.
Sure.
We don't want to get into this or that. The truth of the matter is, not to speak is a form of speech. Now, let's put up this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was one of the greats that opposed Adolf Hitler, etc. And he says something that is very convicting. He says, silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Close quote. So if I pull this idea that, I'm just going to remain neutral, I'm not going to open my mouth because if I let you speak, I'm going to offend somebody else. That's a form of speech. Silence is speech.
Oh, it absolutely is. and it goes to, a lot of the things that I was involved in the legislature. Was I willing to speak up and say, hey, wait a second, this isn't right. What can we do about that? But if I let it go, then I'm missing the opportunity to say what I believe the truth is and what we should be doing. And so that's the call to Christianity. Now, interestingly, I was listening to a guy this morning. I was just doing a little research a little bit, a new person at Second Baptist, but he was saying this is a quote that's attributed to him, but he can't make the connection. He wrote a book on this guy.
Okay.
But it's okay.
Still a great quote.
It's a great quote. And
you're probably talking about Eric Metaxas, I think, wrote a book on Bonhoeffer.
I think that's who.
So he would be a better source to go to.
Yeah, but that's right on.
Yeah.
For us Christians in the marketplace today to speak and to act, and if we don't, then things are not going to be the way God wants them to be.
Yeah, here's another quote floating out there. This is attributed to Lincoln. So you folks out there can research it to see if he said it. But the way it's been presented to me is Lincoln was thinking about slavery one time, and he gave a comment. He said, if I ever get a chance to hit that, I'm going to hit it hard. And he said it as a young person before he went into office. He said, Lord, if you put me in a position where I can take a swat at that wicked, evil institution, I'm going to hit it as hard as I can. Yeah. And we need that mindset, don't we?
We do. Just to give you another example, and we talked about this a little bit earlier about the Article 5 in the Constitution. It was my first session, or second session, and a group of patriots were heading the Article 5 issue, which deals with amendments to the Constitution. And Article 5 is very clear, and it says the Congress can propose amendments to the Constitution to be ratified by the states, or 2/3 of the legislatures can come forward and request a constitution or a convention of the states to only deal with amendments to the Constitution, not to rewrite the Constitution, but it's Article 5 is very clear. It's exactly what it says. So a group came to me and said, hey, we like who you are. We like what you represent. You're a strong Christian. Would you carry this in the Texas House? And so we did, and it was an interesting process in putting that forward. But it deals with certain issues. It deals with rolling back the regulations that the administration puts in place that handcuffs businesses or just doing business, and rolling back those regulations, which happened in the last presidency, I believe, and then taking a look at the fiscal. Balancing the budget requires for a balanced budget in Washington. Texas, we have to have a balanced budget. It's in our Constitution. And then the third thing was looking at term limits, big issue that gets floated around a little bit. And so, anyway, we got, during the first time I carried it, it went right down to the wire near the end of the session. I finally got it passed on the Texas House floor, went right across to the Senate, and there were 3 senators waiting for me over there to say, I'll carry it, I'll carry it, I'll carry it. And so they picked it up, but it didn't get past the Senate that time. So the next session, we brought it back, and we did get it passed. So Texas is one of the, I don't know how many states now, 18 or 20 states that has passed that same resolution calling for Article 5 Convention of the States.
Now, the Convention of the States, how many states have to sign on to that?
2/3.
2/3.
2/3 of the states have to pass roughly, if not exactly, the same resolution sent to Congress that says we request to have a convention of the states, basically.
Which would allow the states to come together and roll back tyrannical Fedzilla, as I call it, federal government.
And those 3 areas in particular, but they could propose other amendments to the. It's interesting. We had a mock convention of the states in Williamsburg, Virginia. I was invited to by this group, a convention of states people, and all the states were represented. And the one bill that I was carrying, and there were 3 of us from Texas, was to do away with the tax issues in Texas. I mean, not Texas, but to the federal tax. Get rid of the federal tax.
Income tax.
Right, income tax. And
move us to like more of a spending consumer.
Just like we do in Texas,
okay.
Right? We have no income tax. So just like Texas. And so that bill in committee was a hot debate, but we ended up passing it out of committee to the floor for the convention of the states to deal with, and it passed. So anyway, so some things like that can be done, but if we don't do it, if we don't step up and take that opportunity, then it's not going to happen. And I know the convention of states is controversial to some degree, but all you have to do is read the Constitution And it's very clear that the sole purpose of the Convention of the States
Yeah, let's put this up.
is
People can see that
is,
copy of the Constitution.
just to propose amendments to the Constitution. That's what Article 5 says very specifically.
So it's almost as if the founders were so prescient. In other words, we're going to do everything we can to keep you out of tyranny, because they knew that the default mode of most governments in human history are tyrannical.
That's right.
So we're going to, if this doesn't keep you free, well, we're going to put this in. And if that doesn't keep you free, we're going to put this in.
That's right.
And one of the last resorts that we have is this Article 5 Convention on the States, which we might have to use at some point, should we come under the auspices of a tyrannical government.
And it falls under we the people, right? The first slide you showed, we the people, the states, can step up and do this.
Yeah.
It's an interesting process in trying to get the 30-some states to pass it.
Yeah, important issue. Let's move to our third S here. This is the scattered evangelical mind. And, when, Norm Mason, the political imperative from God, you stepping up as your assignment from God to get involved in public policy. Most Christians, they just don't think that way. In fact, here, notice this wheel here. These are all the different topics, whether it's sociology, economics, politics, science, history, philosophy, law, ethics, anthropology, psychology, coming back around, sociology, economics. I mean, most Christians look at that and say, well, that's the domain of the secular world.
That's right.
The Bible is spiritual. So we've made this distinction between the spiritual, the sacred and the supposedly the profane. And we think the Bible is just a spiritual book. It's about how to get to heaven. Now, it tells you that, and that's its most important message.
Most important.
And we don't understand that this Bible, when it was breathed into existence by God himself, it comments on every area of life. And when it comments on those other areas, it's just as inspired there
It is.
as it is when it talks about John 3:16. Notice this pyramid. You'll notice that at the foundation we have the Bible, and then built on a biblical understanding is the whole concept of politics. That's in the Bible. Literature, industry, finances. Did you know that the Bible says more about money than it does any other single subject?
I think I've heard that from you.
Probably right. It talks about music. It talks about science. Get the book by Henry Morris, Men of Science, Men of God, where he just historically documents that all of the leaders of every major area of science, like Isaac Newton, got their incentive to study the laws of science from their knowledge of God, because they thought, well, if the Creator put everything together, there must be laws in the physical world that I need to figure out. That's where Isaac Newton, articulates the law of gravity. Most people don't know this, but Isaac Newton wrote commentaries on Daniel and Revelation.
I didn't know that.
And the secular left says, gosh, I wish he would have spent more time with science and not the Bible. Well, silly comment, because it was his knowledge of the Bible that gave him an incentive to study science. Art comes out of that. Let's put this chart up here, beginning themes from the book of Genesis, where we learn that God is the author of the universe, life, man, marriage, conscience, clothing, salvation, the first language, multiple languages, nations, Israel. The one I've got underlined there is government. God created government.
He did.
It's part of the Noahic covenant. Genesis.
Norm Mason told us.
It's in the Norm Mason
God
book.
told us.
God told us, and Norm Mason reported it accurately. And so if God is the author of the state, shouldn't we as Christians have a natural interest in how the state is run?
We should. There's no question about that. And That's what grabbed me. I spent 30 years in the Navy, and as a officer in the Navy, I couldn't get too political, if political at all. Matter of fact, I hesitate sometimes to ask my son, who's the commanding officer of an aircraft carrier now, what do you think about what's going on in the Navy today and in the military? And he said, "Are we on the record?" I said, "Well, not with me." But he has to be careful what he says. And so the wokeness that's happening in our government and in our Department of Defense is really unnerving. It goes into recruiting. I don't know whether we can talk about that, but
Talk about it. Yeah, let's bring it up.
Our military services aren't meeting their recruiting goals. Well, why is that? Well, because of what's happening in the current administration and current Department of Defense leadership. These young men, women aren't signing up to serve because what happened in Afghanistan and our withdrawal there, what's happening in our services today regarding the COVID-19 shot, the COVID shot, and how many people were put out from that. And then we learned more things about the shot. So all of this is affecting that recruiting, and I believe in the peace through strength for our military to have the strongest military, so that we preserve the peace, and that's not, and that we're having the services are struggling to meet those recruiting goals. So,
well, not to get too radical on us here, but here's a thought that crosses my mind: is the time in history comes where a wayward administration could actually take the military and turn it on the American people. And I have a tendency to think that a lot of these things you're talking about that are causing good people to not want to enter or to leave is leaving us with sort of these valueless, characterless type people that would cooperate with tyranny. Now, I talked to Bill Federer, I think you probably know him, wonderful historian about this, and he says, look, they've used everything against us. They've used Hollywood against us. They've used the media against us. They've used the educational system against us. Are we so naive to think that they won't use the military against us? I pray that will never happen, but that could happen. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it could. I think and hope and pray that we have enough strength and character in our senior military leaders for that not to happen, for them to rise up and say no. I hope so. But in that selection of people to move into that senior level of our military, there's somewhat politicalness in that decision on who to select and who not to select. And that's part of the problem today. And I think my son would agree with that, as I see it. It wasn't so much when I was serving, although, a little quick story, is when I was in the Pentagon, my second time, I was there 3 times, Bill Clinton was president, and I could visibly see the military uniform people, senior leaders, get farther and farther away from the appointed people in the Pentagon, just because of the differences in what they were trying to do with our military. And so if that happens, and who's in charge of our military? It's not the uniform members, it's the civilian leadership. That's why we have a Secretary of Defense and a Secretary of the Services, and so they're really the ones in charge. The president's in charge. He's the commander-in-chief. And so if that were to ever happen, Andy, then we've lost it. I think we really have lost it for sure. So I hope I hope we have enough good, strong Christian leadership in our military that would say, no, we're not going there.
Well, this distinction that we're talking about between the secular and the sacred, that the role of the Christian is just spiritual things, but nothing outside of that, we know that doesn't come from God.
Right.
I mean, we've seen his word doesn't support
Oh,
that.
absolutely
Who
not.
came up with this? Our enemies are the
Right.
ones that largely have created this artificial wedge. Now, here's a quote from, allegedly from Adolf Hitler. I found this in Chuck Colson's book, Kingdoms in Conflict. And it has to do with Pastor Niemöller, who was another one of the pastors that was standing up against Hitler. And Hitler is alleged to have said to Pastor Niemöller, I, quote, I will protect the German people. You take care of the church. This is what we're fighting against
Right.
in our conversation.
That's right.
Continuing with the quote, you pastors should worry about getting people to heaven and leave this world to me, close quote. And we know how that story ended.
Right. And what happened, the churches didn't stand up. They didn't roll back on this. People didn't. And look what happened.
In fact, there's old footage, black and white footage of some churches actually having a Nazi flag, right there on the platform in the church.
This fellow that we talked about earlier at Second Baptist, his family was in Germany, and from Germany, and he said Germany at the time was a very Christian country.
That's where the Protestant Reformation.
That's right. They were a
came
very
from.
Christian community or country, and yet they allowed this to happen.
Yes.
And we know the results of that.
Yeah, and it was Hitler that was pushing this wedge. Now, here's one of my favorite Ann Coulter quotes. And again, am I endorsing everything Ann Coulter has ever said or did? No, but I like this quote. She says, quote, first, they claim there is no place for religion in the public square. And then they expand the public square to include everything. And it's subtle in terms of language where they say, and you watched Obama when he was in office, did this frequently. He would call the First Amendment, the right that we're exercising right now, freedom of worship. Well, I'm sorry. The First Amendment, you have the Constitution right there. It doesn't say freedom of worship. It says freedom of religion. And by that subtle change of language, basically what they were saying is, you can do whatever you want in the four walls of your church. But the truth of the matter is freedom of religion is a protection that follows you into the marketplace of ideas, into the workplace, into the secular world, into the home. In other words, you're protected as an American based on your religious conscience, no matter where you are, in a church or out of a church. And so, folks, every time you hear the expression freedom of worship from a political figure, you need to push back against that and call it freedom of religion.
Right. And there is a there is a big pushback today on silencing that voice because they don't want that voice out in the public square. And that's what we can't allow to happen. We have to be in the public square, and we have to be out there energized to make a difference in what's going on. That's what God expects us all to do. I think that's where I come from.
Yeah, and as a pastor, my priority is the gospel. And if my priority is the gospel, then my priority automatically becomes government, because I want to make sure that I can legally proclaim the gospel.
Yes.
And the realm that decides whether I can do that or not is the state. So every pastor should have an automatic interest in government, just based on what I just said.
They should. And just another example, what happened in the Texas legislature, and I don't remember, it was before I got there, maybe 2 or 3 sessions before I got there, but now in the House and Senate, the words are "In God We Trust." They're in the two bodies, and so that's great. But my desk mate of 8 years from Houston, a strong Christian man, and he and I were in the right place to make a difference. But that was something that we were happy to see that was there, right? In God We Trust. It's in the legislature, the Texas legislature. So it's just up to us Christians when we get issues that aren't following that, perspective of the biblical worldview, that we have to stand up and say no.
Right.
We can't let those things happen, be it marijuana or drugs or the border or all the issues of homosexuality, abortion. Excuse me. There are just so many issues that we need to stand up and be accounted for.
Yeah, because really these aren't political issues; these are Bible
They're
issues.
biblical issues,
Yeah.
right?
All right, let's get to our last S here as time is kind of winding down.
Excuse me.
And it has to do with sacrifice, meaning the assignment of passing down the concept of freedom to our kin, to our lineage. That's not something that just automatically happens.
No.
That requires work, effort, and sacrifice. It's like your garden or your lawn at home. If you just leave it alone, weeds are going to get the upper hand. You've got to take active effort to uproot the weeds. Now, why don't we see that with government? I mean, we have to be vigilant. We have to be on top of this. We have to make sure it's moving in the right direction as long as we have the ability, freedom-wise, to do it. And so where do we ever get the idea that this responsibility that we have is simple?
I don't know. I can't answer that, but I will say that every time I had the opportunity to encourage people, especially Christians, but anyone, to show up, I would get calls from people about the city of Sugar Land. Do you know what they're thinking about doing? And the city council. And I said, well, have you been to a city council meeting? Have you participated? Because you can, right? And when it comes time to tax issues or any other important thing that they're thinking about doing, there's an opportunity for you to speak and to say, hey, you object to this. And I'll give an example. I believe it was a tax issue, and one of the members here, or people, Bruce Bond, Bruce and I said, Bruce, do you go and testify and tell them what you think? And by gosh, he did. He stood up, because I would go most of their meetings. And I remember the first time I started going to the City of Sugar Land council meetings, they said, why are you here? I said, well, because I represent you, one thing, and because if people come to me and ask me, what the heck are you guys doing? And so, but Bruce did that. He stood up and he spoke up, and by gosh, he made a difference in their decision and what they were doing. And that's what people need to do. The government that impacts the people the most is the local government, the city government, the county government, and the school districts. If you think about it, you know what I did in Austin impacted the people in my district, but across the state. But the local governance is the one where we need more people participating. If you think about it, in our school board meetings, things that are happening in our school systems today are just
Insane.
Insane.
Yeah.
And so, and thank God we have people like the new governor of Virginia
Yes.
who took that on and rallied the parents, because who should control their children's education but the parents? Yeah. And so. So I think that's building. I think that crescendo is happening with more people saying, "You bet, that's what we need to be doing." So, but that's my view, and I would encourage people just to do that. I don't want to be the only one at the city council meeting. Right. So.
Well, I recall walking out of this church after one of the services, and I typically see you. And this, I can't remember the exact election cycle this was, but it was like a really strong conservative victory. And I can't remember if it was midterm or what it was, but I said to you, what do you think? Expecting this kind of glowing answer from you, and you just simply said, well, Texas showed up.
Right.
We showed up.
Right.
And that's half the battle.
It is.
You just show up.
You have to show up, and then you got to stand up, and then you got to speak up.
There you go.
And that's what I'm encouraging everybody today to do that.
Well, Ronald Reagan, let's close with a couple of his quotes. Yeah, that's okay. He says here, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. He made this statement in 1961. Right. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for and protected and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day, he used such powerful word pictures. One day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States of America, where men were free.
Right.
1961, I feel like he's talking about right now.
He is. He's talking about right now. And, if we look back in the recent history of our country, he followed a guy named Carter. And I lived through that in the military. And of course, I was during this time. And so he made a difference. And I think God does enable or give us the right person at the right time in these cases. And so I have the faith that God is going to do that again.
Well, let's pray to that effect. And here's another quote from Reagan in his famous A Time for Choosing speech, 1964. And he says, quote, "Not long ago, two friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee. A businessman who had escaped from Castro, and in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, 'We don't know how lucky we are.' And the Cuban stopped and said, 'How lucky you are? I had some place to escape to.' And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to.
Right.
This is the last stand on earth," close quote. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. Yes, I do agree with that. And so it goes back to us wanting to preserve what we were given from the founders. And if we're not willing to do that, I think I've watched this over my years in the political arena, is that unless something impacts
Them
people
personally. Yeah.
they don't care, or they don't seem to care about it. That's not the time we're in right now. Okay, things are impacting everybody right now, but this is where we have to take the initiative as Christians to stand up and participate, either in running for office and being that person that can carry the mail, or in supporting people, going to people and say, "Hey, Rick, why don't you do this?" And that's what happened to me. People came to me and said, "Hey, look, we know who you are. We know what you've done. It's time for you to do this." And so that's what helped me to do that.
And a lot of people would say, well, that's an unchristian way of life. But let's look at the Bible. I just made a list of people that were involved in the political process in the Bible. Here's a short list. Joseph in Egypt. Moses in Egypt. Have people not read the book of Daniel? Daniel in
Right.
Babylon and
Right.
Persia. What about Esther in the Persian
Mordecai
time
and
period?
Esther, right.
Mordecai and Esther. What about Nehemiah? We could add to this list many different names, but it just seems to me to be logical and natural and a normal place for God's people to be, which is in the political process, being that preservative influence until Jesus comes back one day and sets up his kingdom.
That's right. We can't be afraid. We can't be afraid to participate. God will protect us. God will take care of us. If God wants us to do this, He will enable it to happen. That's why I believe that, and I trust that. And so we just can't be afraid to do this.
Have you seen, as you've stepped out in faith to serve in this way, divine protection in your life in different ways?
In different ways. In different ways, for sure. Yes. Now, if I go back a few years ago, this wokeness was beginning to happen in our political system, in our conservative Republican system, and identity politics. And so that's why I'm not in office anymore, maybe. But because somebody said that maybe Rick is too old and maybe he doesn't look right. Oh my gosh, holy cow.
Meaning the wrong racial composition, the wrong skin color.
That's right. And that came from a very high office. And so,
And that came from someone that would be considered a conservative by most people's understanding.
yes,
Okay.
yes. And
So wokeness is something that kind of pervades across the political spectrum.
it goes across the political landscape, and that was one of the things when I first got involved in the political process as a Christian, that we didn't accept that. It wasn't part of who we were, and yet now we have allowed that to come in, and so we have to rise up and say that's not acceptable. I don't care who you are; it's just not the way we want this to happen. And so anyway, that's been going on now for a few years, and in both sides. So
Well, I think we've had a great conversation today on the eve of a historic midterm, just causing people to maybe think a little more deeply about what role they would play in this pivotal time in our history. I would suggest three things as a bare minimum. Number one, read. Read books like this.
right,
There's a lot of wonderful ones out there.
right.
Get up to speed on the way God thinks about, political things, but they're really biblical things.
Right.
Number two, register. There's absolutely no excuse for anybody that names the name of Christ not to have registered to vote. You were reaching for something.
I was going to show you the differences in the party platforms from a biblical voter perspective, and I think that's one thing that I would encourage people to do, no matter who you are, is look at the party platforms from a biblical perspective, and it's clear where we should vote.
Yeah, on these different issues.
And what you did yesterday with Dr. Teague was wonderful in vetting him as a candidate. Well, how do you feel about this, and how do you feel about this? And I think that should happen across the board if possible. There are surveys out there that do that if people respond. But what do the two main political parties stand for?
Yeah.
And from a biblical perspective, there's no comparison.
And this has got it categorized on the basis of life,
Right.
Marriage and family as the building block of society, education, Second Amendment, support for Israel, climate change, religious freedom. And so a document like this has their stated views. And so we have to scrutinize parties. And then when someone you like gets in there, you make sure that they're held accountable to what they say they're going to do according to their party. And of course, if someone else gets in that doesn't have this view, there's nothing to hold them accountable to.
Right.
So, and look at different candidates and where they stand. We don't insult people by telling them who to vote for. We just try to equip them with biblical truth. And we feel that God has given people minds. And there's a lot more up here than we give people credit for. And be discerners in these last days.
Discernment, wisdom, knowledge, all that's in, you read Proverbs, right?
Yes.
And I remember one time I proposed this to a pastor. I said, look, just put the two platforms up. Don't label them what they are. Just put the platforms up and say, from a biblical perspective, where do we fit as Christians? And just show that to your congregation.
So we've got read, we've got register, and then the last thing, obviously, is to vote. And I've come across some really troubling statistics that half of those who name the name of Christ are registered. Of that number, only half of that number actually shows up.
That's right.
As consistent voters. Now think of how different this country would be. Think of the initial quote by Finney that we gave. Right. If everyone that's a biblicist was registered, and then they actually voted, and they didn't vote on what their parents believed, or, gee, I've got to get this guy in so my office can get a big government contract, or what tax bracket am I going to be in? They put all that aside, and they just went to God's word, and they voted based on this book. Could you imagine how different this country would be?
Oh, it'd be fantastic. It'd be great, because you know, it's a kind of maybe a trite expression, but elections do matter. And this one coming up is pretty important.
Pretty,
So
you
I
know,
heard you say yesterday, maybe the most important.
well, they say that every cycle.
Right.
This is the most important one ever. This time I actually think it is.
Well, because we can stop, to some degree, what's happening in our federal government, and so it matters. It matters, and like you said, if the Christians were registered and they actually voted and showed up to vote based on what they believed, and the candidates, they vet the candidates. There are far too many people, and probably on both sides of the aisle, that if you got an R behind your name, I'm going to vote R. Okay, that's good. But if you got a D behind your name, I'm going to vote D. And that's not what really we need to have happen. We need informed, educated voters who are willing to stand for what they believe.
Yeah,
And
biblicism.
biblical.
Biblicism.
Right.
So I think we're going to wrap it up with that. I just want to remind people here in Texas, early voting starts the 24th.
Monday.
And we'll move into the 24th through the 4th.
Right.
And then the main election, the main election is, well, not the main one, but the election
Actual
day.
election
I'd like to have you back some other time and talk about, do we need an election day or an election week?
We need an election day.
That's what I think too. But we can get to that.
It used to be that way.
That's,
right? I mean, and people complain on one particular side that we're trying to suppress the voting when actually we're enabled more voting to occur. And look what's happening in Georgia today. I heard that there were more people showing up early to vote than ever before. And yet what's coming out of some critical top offices is we are suppressing the vote in Georgia. No, we're not.
Yeah.
No, they're not.
Well, we can have a great conversation about that some other time and many other subjects. But for now, we just want to get people to think in general terms, biblically, and we want Christians, to be involved in the process. So, Rick Miller, one of the greats, in my opinion.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks for sharing your expertise with us.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for allowing me to be here, Andy.
Very good.
I really appreciate that.
Very
Enjoyed
good.
it. Thank you, sir.
Very good. God bless you, and we'll see you next time on Pastor's Point of View.
Bye.